It is just amazing. Hello and welcome to Media Monitor on the SABC News Channel, independent and impartial. Now, this is where we take a look inside the world of media, analysing the trends, the issues and the reporting of some of the week's top stories. I'm Peter Ndoro and this is what's coming up on the show. Recently, the director of the BBC World Service was in South Africa and we got his thoughts about public broadcasting funding, fake news and also investing in African journalism. Now, one of our international editors, you'll have seen him a few times, Zweli, Dlamini of the Swaziland News, joined us in studio and he told us why he again had to flee the Kingdom of Eswatini due to threats made on his life. And we also go back in history. We love that section of the show. And this week we go to 2006, celebrating a South African film that won an Oscar that year. Can you remember which film it was and what it was for? Find out a little bit later on in the show. So that's the show, but remember you can engage with us on social media. We look forward to hearing from you. Our Twitter handle is #SABC Media Monitor, #SABC Media Monitor. Now, before we get into our highlighted stories on the program, let's first take a look at what's on the front pages of the Sunday newspapers this morning. And we start with the Sunday Times. And the front page there is all about the coronavirus COVID-19. Now, one of the stories says that as South Africans in Wuhan City, the epicenter of the virus, are desperate to leave, plans have been scuppered as the hotel that they were meant to be quarantined in South Africa has changed its mind about housing them following intimidation apparently from locals. The City Press is reporting that the 2 confirmed cases of COVID-19 coronavirus have sent citizens into a tailspin despite the health minister's call for calm and offering assurances that the virus can be contained. The Sunday Independent is leading with a story of Public Enterprises Minister Pravin Gordhan saying that he's appointed another senior government official without a post-matric qualification. The paper reports that Ntamiseng Boroto has been appointed as the minister's chief of staff despite not meeting the minimum criteria for the job. The Sunday Tribune has the story of more coronavirus cases confirmed, stating that alleging that a woman has tested positive and a South African man is in isolation in South Korea after testing positive at an airport there as he was trying to fly back home. Now, the Weekend Argus is running the same story of the new COVID-19 cases. There's also a story of 30 people being trapped after a 5-story hotel being used as a coronavirus quarantine site collapsed in the southeast port city of Guangzhou. And the Sunday World, you can't believe this kind of story, but they're leading with a story that says life imitating art. This after Izinkabi or hitmen allegedly hired to kill actor, playwright and director Thobani Nzuza, who's currently appearing on the popular SABC1 television drama Uzalo. Apparently, these hitmen, and it's being described as a hit, assassins broke into Nzuza's house and beat up one of his friends after they failed to find the actor. Alright, so that's your Sunday newspapers. We'll chat a little bit more about those later on. But first, let's take a look at what captured your attention on social media. And we go to the platform Twitter as usual. And this is what was trending a short while ago. This is about 40 minutes ago. Alright, so that's the list. And UFC seems to always be there or thereabouts. And some of these others, Adesanya, Romero, all related to the UFC. But the one that really captured my attention is the second trend, Me and My Pops. And there you see images and messages of people sharing pictures with their parents, with their fathers in particular actually. And some of them are sad because they said this was the last picture that I had with my dad, or this was my dad on the day that I got married. And it's just very nice messages that have been coming through. Me and My Pops. So go on there and perhaps you could post your picture of you and your pops. All right, so there's so much to get through on the show this morning, and helping us make sense of these stories are my guest editors, the Executive Director at the South African Editors Forum, Dr. Kate Skinner, and the CEO at Frey Intermedia, Paula Frey. To both of you, a very good morning, ladies. Thanks very much for joining us. Give us a wave.
Good morning.
There we go. We'll be chatting to them throughout the course of the program. But first, the director of the BBC World Service Group, Jamie Angus, was in South Africa recently. I caught up with him and spoke about the challenges public broadcasters face when it comes to funding and how the BBC is finding new ways to generate revenue abroad. He also talked about the launch of this year's BBC Komla Dumont Award, which aims to help develop talent in African journalism. Now, this is how the conversation went. Jamie, thanks very much indeed for joining us. A lot to talk about, but I want to start with public broadcaster funding. The BBC pretty much invented that which we now know as a TV license. I think it was called a wireless license back in 1927. But the idea was to fund the service, and South Africa went the same route. We do also have advertising, something you don't do in the UK. But things have changed a lot over time, and I just wonder what's been the change for you at the BBC, and what lies ahead?
Well, the BBC's funding is set 11 years at a time under a royal charter signed by the Queen, and the current charter runs up until 2027, so we know we'll have the licence fee in the UK until that period. But you're right that the way that TV content, what we used to think of as TV content, but now is of course streaming video and on mobiles and elsewhere. That video content is available in all kinds of different ways, and people are used to paying for them in different ways. So it's entirely reasonable that there's a public debate in the UK about whether the licence fee is still the right model. My personal view is it's probably the least worst of all the options. I think every funding mechanism has its drawbacks and its strengths. But I think one of the things that the BBC argues for really strongly around the licence fee is that it is a universal funding mechanism that ensures that every single person in the country has a stake in the national public broadcaster, and for better or worse. And people are angry at us sometimes, and sometimes they love us, and sometimes a bit of both at the same time. But it means that every person in the UK is touched by the BBC's services and still used weekly by over 80% of the UK population. And that's really, really important to us. And I think the big challenge in potentially changing the system is to find a system that allows a public broadcaster to do a universal range of services, as well as what we might call the market failure services. So particular services that the commercial market couldn't sustain. People who work at the BBC believe in the universal model, that it shouldn't just be a market failure broadcaster and only do programming for minority and minority groups, or arts coverage that the market can't sustain, or the things like the BBC World Service, which have to be publicly funded. And I think that's going to be a big debate in the UK in the years to come.
So, but outside the UK, this is where you start earning revenues, and part of the reason why you're in South Africa. Tell us about that and how that contributes to paying for some of your content.
Well, that's right. The BBC World Service has a range of different services, TV, radio and online. And our radio services, World Service Radio, which people will probably know, is funded out of the licence fee. So essentially the UK licence fee payer is paying for that. But our TV channel, BBC World News, and the bbc.com website are entirely commercially funded. So you'll see advertising on those channels and on the site. And the channel is available on DSTV, who we charge a carriage fee. We're a commercial TV company outside of the UK, but the value of what people see remains the same, and the trust remains the same. And I think one of the things we want to talk about is how audiences need to trust major news brands in the way that they did in the past, because the way that news is consumed more and more digitally means we do have this rising problem of fake news and disinformation. People don't tend to trust what's in front of them. And I think one of my messages is, if you have a BBC brand that you trust, or another news brand that you trust, use the brand that you trust on their platform, and then that the material has integrity. Whereas if you see a shared WhatsApp message with a video in, you don't know if that video is true or false. But if you go to the BBC or another trusted national provider like yourselves here at the SABC, you'll know on their platform or on our platform that real journalists have done real verification on those stories.
Right. Okay, let's move on. You've mentioned fake news, a big problem worldwide now. How has the BBC worked to try and combat it and perhaps help the public?
Well, we have a great ability to see into lots of different markets globally, because not as well as broadcasting in English, we have 42 different language services, including a large number of African languages. We also have BBC Monitoring, our open source media monitoring arm, who look at media broadcasts around the world, including here in South Africa. So we think that we're able to spot the trends and patterns around fake news and analyse them better than others. So under the Beyond Fake News banner, which people can find on bbc.com/Beyond Fake News, we've aggregated all our learning and analysis of fake news. But of course, even an organisation with the resources of the BBC can't check every individual news story around the world. So another thing we're interested in is supporting learning, particularly in schools and for young audiences, around what we might call media literacy. So we've made training materials available to schools, including here in South Africa through the British Council, to try and engage young audiences and school children with how to tell the difference between the real and the fake. And we're also running here in South Africa a program called My World, which is deliberately aimed at teenage audiences, so for 13-year-olds, to help them understand the values that stand behind trusted news and how to understand the world through the medium of news with a discriminatory understanding.
All right, so let's move on to journalism on the continent, and I want to talk a little bit about the Comla Dumont award for journalism that the BBC sponsors. I was very lucky to have worked with him at Bush House. A great guy and great journalist. What was the thinking behind setting up this award in his memory?
Well, of course, it was a terrible blow to all of us. Comla's untimely death in 2014 robbed us of a unique global broadcasting talent, and I think he really was entering into the first rank, the front line of the BBC's global presenters. Of course, he was the launch presenter of the BBC's Focus on Africa daily TV bulletin, which is a revolution for us to start providing that in 2012. And once we'd moved on from the sense of loss about his death, we wanted to, along with his family, to set up a legacy that would really show what he stood for, which was empowering African journalists. And the Comla Dumont training bursary really, we hope, will fulfill that. We take one winner every year. This is the 6th year of the award. We offer them 3 months of training and work in the BBC in London, and then they would return to their host broadcaster or news organisation. And as well as helping them learn some of the new skills that we have in the building, particularly digital skills or investigative journalism or data journalism or visual journalism, some of the things that we think we do best in class, we want that journalist to then return to their home market and then help share that learning with their own organisation. And many have returned and some have stayed with the BBC. So it's been a really good model for us, because it also allows us to see the most talented African journalists in the pipeline as they're coming on through, and also make a statement about the BBC wanting to be a partner with African journalism organisations to keep training and standards high and to share what we know.
Well, let's talk about that partnership and promoting journalism across the continent. I mean, sometimes people switch on the TV and they see journalists from the UK here telling local stories. How do you balance the idea that you can come all the way from London, tell stories here, but also, I suppose, find ways to incorporate local journalists?
Well, we've always done both, but I think increasingly in recent years, the BBC's new investment in Africa has been in African journalists telling Africa's stories to the world through the BBC. And, being in Johannesburg this week, being here with our local journalists who we employ in Johannesburg, we feel that gives us real authority. We tell South Africa's stories back to the world with real authority and understanding of the local market. And I think that matters to South Africans because, of course, your stories are the world stories. So if you just look around the stories we have this week about the budget, about finance, sustainability, the environment, fears about coronavirus, like these are all stories that are directly relevant to all our global audiences. And so we very much want to have those African stories told by African journalists.
So why did you come so late with television to Africa? I mean, the World Service has been there for ages, and a lot of people, particularly when regimes were running the continent, they relied on the World Service for news. Television was a really late entry.
Well, partly it's because television has only grown latterly on the continent itself. So we've always been, BBC World News has always been present here. The additional African programming that we're making through the new investment in African journalism, so that's programs like Fact Finder, The She Word, Africa Eye, which runs here in the market in South Africa, our investigative journalism strand. Those are programs that we make and then we distribute them via partner broadcasters, including here on the SABC. And so we make programming and share it with broadcasters around Africa, and we don't make a profit from that. We just do it because we want partners to distribute our content for us. You're right that TV is an enormous growth platform here in South Africa and in Southern Africa generally. You know, although the world is obsessed with the rise of digital media, and rightly so, because in the long term digital will be the future, we know that there will be really healthy household growth in terms of TV households in sub-Saharan Africa for many years to come. And TV channels can ride off the back of that, including here in South Africa. So although the death of linear TV is often foretold, I think certainly in Africa is probably decades away, because audiences will still want a good high quality TV to watch drama and sport particularly, and in doing so they will also consume a lot of news, and that's good for the SABC and good for the BBC too.
Jamie, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thanks so much indeed for coming through.
Thank you. Nice to see you. Thank you.
Welcome back. You're still watching Media Monitor. Now, just before the break, in that conversation I had with the director of the BBC World Service, one of the things that we spoke about was developing journalism talent on the continent, and just how well are we doing to improve journalism standards on the continent. Last year, Wits University publication State of the Newsroom pointed to real shifts in industry, suggesting an ongoing weakening of that we have come to know as a traditional news setup. Now, there are a number of contributing factors: digitization, changes in revenue models. But what about the quality of the journalism itself, and what can be done to improve standards? Well, let's ask our guest editors to chip in. Ladies, thanks so much for joining us, and happy International Women's Day. Let me start there.
Thank you.
All right, so let me start with you, Paula, because I know that you do quite a bit of training across the continent, not just here in South Africa. And I just wondered your assessment of journalism standards. If we go back 10, 15 years and you compare to now, where are we?
Because I always talk about training, I worry that people think that I think that journalism on the continent is in a really bad state. But in fact, journalism on the continent is really thriving, that there are a lot of really good examples of good journalism. If you think of Namibia, the fish rot scandal, even here in South Africa, if you think of the investigative journalism there, if you think of Nas in Ghana, you really have really strong journalists across the continent. But what we're seeing is the erosion of the day-to-day quality of journalism by the changing technology. And you know, journalism is a dynamic profession. The skills that you come into the profession after 2 or 3 years, they're just no longer as relevant as what you need to be learning on an ongoing way, whether it's knowledge, whether it's just simply honing your craft. And so I think one of the things that we find across the continent is that in newsrooms that are very, very thin, that there's less time for us to be able to go out and refresh our skills and to learn new skills. And so I think that's where we're suffering, is that day-to-day practice of journalism, that we're just not doing enough to continually look at things like verification, learning the new technology, or even just something like being up to speed with the knowledge around an issue like coronavirus.
And also, I guess things are happening much quicker than ever before with the digital platform. Your deadlines used to be, for the late edition, the story must be in by 3 o'clock that afternoon. But now it has to be in the next 30 seconds. Is that contributing, do you think, to, I don't know. Some people are saying that our journalism, as they say, is not being checked properly, is not being written properly even sometimes. It's just being gotten out into the system.
Yes, I mean, I think that speed and the fact that also you have to kind of post on multiple platforms, all of that is contributing. But I think one of the big things, and it's been fascinating to talk to people that are, real veterans or trainers in the, and one of the things that they've basically said is, a lot of our training is very good, but it's the environment and it's the issue of the number of retrenchments, the fact that people are very thin on the ground, and also that news editors don't have a lot of time to mentor anybody. And so it's that financial kind of austerity, I think, that has had a huge impact on journalism and the quality of journalism. And we really absolutely have to look at those financial issues, I think.
I know that SANEF has an education committee, or and what is coming up more and more in that committee?
So it is interesting. So I mean, specific education and training committee. So we've been working on qualifications, like a journalism qualification, which is very practical, very much what Paul is saying, to make sure that people are up to speed on all the latest technology, that day-to-day kind of journalism work. So we've done a lot of work on that. We've done a lot of work, in fact, around specific projects like elections. So to make sure that journalists around the country have a deep understanding of that kind of thing. And also, I think what's been interesting is we've got this inquiry into journalism ethics and credibility, and one of the big areas that is coming up is around education and training and those kinds of issues. But my understanding is that a lot of that has been linked then back to some of the financial crises in the industry, saying, of course we can fix journalism, we can do more courses, we can have a wonderful journalism qualification, all of those things. But if we don't fix some of those bottom line issues around the financing, we are always going to be, on the back foot. Yeah.
Paula, we've got lots of great journalism schools, and even the Institute of Advancement of Journalism is there. All of these bodies are there. I get a sense sometimes that they finish, they cum laude their qualifications, they get into the area but don't stay. Is that something that we're seeing? And what is that? Is it just pay, or is it the environment? What's going on?
Well, I think one of the things that we've seen, not only in South Africa but across the continent, is a huge number of retrenchments, and so the actual number of jobs in the profession are shrinking. We've also found the juniorization to a large degree of newsrooms, where newsrooms themselves are younger and younger. The people who even lead are sometimes very, very young, which is not necessarily a bad thing. I think young people bring a lot of energy and a better understanding of the technology and how to tell stories with the new technology, sometimes than we give them credit for. I think the great pressure also is this financial pressure that we're seeing in the media, where there are very often opportunities outside of the media to be able to do better, but also huge pressure when you're in the media to be working harder, smarter, and basically churning out content in order to meet the demand of a social media era, right?
It used to be that if you were a young journalist, you'd be given a mentor, and you were a cub even. They use words like that. I don't know that we see this much anymore.
No, I think that is, I mean, some of the things that I've picked up in terms of it, particularly, talking to a whole lot of people around our inquiry, etc., is that they don't have that mentorship. And the thing is, it's a really tough environment in the newsroom. And I think all the things that Paula has said are all true, but over and above that, there's also incredible harassment of journalists. So particular journalists that are covering tough stories, investigative pieces, I mean, are literally trolled to, and the thing is that I think that our journalism, our media houses aren't actually probably good enough in terms of ensuring that they support journalists around that. I mean, literally people need trauma counselling. And I think that we as SANEF have also been on the back foot in terms of that. And we are saying now more and more that we've got to make sure that this environment is a little kinder and there's more support. But again, it's a finance issue. And I think that we as an industry body need to look at how do we pool resources around that. Because I think that's also one of the reasons why a number of journalists are leaving the profession, because it's really harsh, and it's really harsh for women. And on an
International Women's Day, it's an important point that we should be making.
Absolutely.
I agree with this this trolling, and you almost, as soon as you go on Twitter, you second guess the words that you're using, because if it's open for any kind of misinterpretation, it will be, and then it just goes berserk.
And I don't think that we can overestimate the impact that social media has had on journalism, right? That constant pressure to be doing the new thing, the new story, updating the story, competing with people who don't have to follow the rules of journalism, which is verification, first and foremost, making sure that the story is right. And so very often you're kind of having a story unfolding on social media, and legacy media are basically playing catch up. But you're absolutely right about the issue of trolling. We did research at Frey Intermedia on the way journalists use social media, and we found that all journalists, male and female, get harassed on social media, but for women it was particularly bad and was particularly of a sexual nature. Very, very often the harassment had sexual overtones, and so you're absolutely right, Kat, that a lot of journalists work under this constant time pressure, but also this constant harassment.
It's International Women's Day, and I think next week or the week after it's going to be Equality Week as well. And there's been issues, we saw it play out in the BBC recently, where they've had to make some startling payments, back payments. Is there still a problem in terms of how female journalists are treated and paid in the industry? What's your take? What's you hearing from your editors?
It's interesting. I mean, I do think that there's issues around pay parity. I mean, there was an interesting report that came out, I think it was in 2018, which we worked on as SANF, and we were looking at it was called the glass ceiling, and the work was done. Professor Glenda Daniels from Wits University was working on that report, and one of the big areas was, journalists doing, absolutely the same work, the same level of authority, and not necessarily being paid the same. I mean, I think things are being improved. I think that that's definitely true. But what was very interesting about that report was it was so difficult to get information. Wow. I mean, Glenda really tried hard and asked a lot of questions. And I mean, she was in the industry herself for years and years, and she really found it difficult. So the fact that the media houses were not that interested, or were, let's say it that way, not forthcoming in terms of that information, I think was problematic, and there's a lot more work to be done there, I think. All
right, Paula, final thoughts before we go into other areas in terms of just how we can maybe just lift standards a bit more.
But I think that there needs to be a recognition that it's an ongoing thing, that it's not a matter of let's send journalists for training and then it's finished, that every single day on the job is a process of being trained, of getting new skills, of being out there and kind of to do better in the profession that we're in.
All right, ladies, let's take a moment to reflect, and when we come back after the break, we'll continue with Media Monitor, international stories, and much more, and going back in history as well. Stay with us. World Health Organization has called on countries to boost their readiness against the COVID-19 coronavirus, saying that the virus is literally knocking at their countries' doors.
Stocks have plunged dramatically amid fears of the rapid spreading of coronavirus into other countries outside of China.
Nobody thought that Iran would be having this problem.
Nigeria has announced its first confirmed case of the novel coronavirus, which is also the first for sub-Saharan Africa.
All Chinese nationals will be forbidden from entering Russia because Moscow now believes that the Chinese outbreak is much riskier. Now cases have topped.
The confirmed number of new cases globally has passed 80,000 as the outbreak continues to grow.
Cape Town law enforcement officers, backed by members of the South African police, moved in and started dismantling dwellings and picking personal possessions of the foreign nationals.
So all these families, they have nowhere to go.
The city of Cape Town is not insensitive to the plight of the refugees, but we simply cannot allow the situation to carry on unchecked.
Every day you're talking about the TV, women abuse, child abuse. Look this woman, look this child. Why are you going to abuse us?
Welcome back. You're still watching Media Monitor. Now, for the International Editor feature, we bring you an interview that we did with Swaziland news editor Zweli Dlamini. Now, he told us why he again had to flee Eswatini, fearing for his life. National editor slot, we're now joined by a journalist from Eswatini, a usual regular on the show, but we often talk to him from there, but he's had to flee the country this time for his own safety. Let's catch up with Zweli Dlamini. Zweli, thanks very much indeed for joining us. The last time that we spoke to you, you had been arrested and for contempt of court, supposedly, but you said that it had political leanings. Since then, you've been taken into police custody again. Tell us what happened.
After that arrest, Peter, I think a week later, police arrived at my home with a search warrant, but the search warrant didn't specify the nature of the case they were investigating. When I arrived there, they seized my laptops and other electronic gadgets. They said they were investigating a case of sedition, but during that time, while they were within my premises, they didn't go deeper. What is it that they were looking for? Then thereafter, after they seized those electronic gadgets, they then made me to sign at the back of the search warrant, saying they just asked if I have any complaints with the raiding. At that time, I didn't have complaints, so yeah. I signed that no complaint because they didn't do much harassment. Yeah. What they did, they took a picture of my four-year-old son, and that was when I had some concern that why are they taking the picture of my 4-year-old son, and they even asked where the name of the preschool he's attending. Okay, then they took me to...
This has no relevance to sedition charges.
Yes, it has no relevance.
Photographing a 4-year-old child and finding out where he goes to school.
Yes,
yeah.
And then they took me to Mbabane police station. And when I arrived there were about 20 police officers from a unit called Tingulungulu. This is the highest investigating unit of the King. They investigate serious crimes in Eswatini. They then asked me to explain my article, which I wrote about the King, titled Kingdom of Eswatini's speech is actually a lie from the throne.
Right.
In that article, I was analysing the speech. It's like the State of the Nation address from the King. And I was just punching holes that every time the King talks about development, taking care of the poor, but what we subsequently see is a luxurious life for himself. So it was based on those grounds where I said I had that view that his speech was actually a lie from the throne. Right. So they were complaining that...
Why did you write this story?
Yes. And then another one is about ceremony. It's a traditional ceremony called Bukanu ceremony. Some Swazis have concern about this ceremony in the fact that married women went there as per the summons of the king. And when they are there, they drink the traditional beer called Bukanu, and other men are also invited to attend. Imagine there are married women there. When they are drunk, the chaos that happens there, you can imagine.
So it often happens that these women are taken advantage of by these men?
Yes, they are taken advantage of. So my article was based on the fact that these are married women, and the king summons them to a traditional ceremony where some of them, not all of them, some of them will drink the traditional beer, and there is no security to make sure that people's marriages are protected.
Okay.
So they were complaining
about
that.
These are the articles that the police were concerned about.
Yes.
What did they then do?
Sorry?
What did they then do to you?
They then asked me to explain word by word what I mean about this article. And when I tried to explain to them, you know, that there were 20. Everyone will just harass me, and they then, when I asked them, okay, because you took me and you want me to explain this thing, just give me a chance to explain my view.
Right.
They said now that I'm before them, I must forget about my rights, because they want me to explain this article. They then suffocated me with a plastic. They tied me.
All right, let me just be clear. They tied you up.
Yes.
And they put a plastic bag over your head.
Yes.
And you were struggling to breathe. They were basically suffocating you.
Yes, I was struggling.
This is the police, Royal Eswatini Police.
Yes.
Wow.
So I have a medical report that I got from when I got the medical checkup.
All right, and what does that medical report say?
Yes, it cited the suffocation.
Yeah.
Yes, I then went for an X-ray to check if my lungs were not damaged.
How long were you in custody for?
They took me around 6 a.m., between 5:30 and 6 a.m. up until around 2 p.m.
All right, and then they let you go. What did they say to you when they let you go?
They said to me, if I continue writing, they will deal with me. They are monitoring me. They've been monitoring me for a long time, and they will definitely deal with me. For now, they will just investigate this electronic gadget to see what is contained there.
So they've confiscated your computers, your laptops. They still have them?
Yes, fortunately, they took, because I have some various electronic gadgets that I use. Fortunately, they didn't take the main one.
Okay.
And my cell phone, they didn't have access to them. Because
but you've had to leave the country now.
Yes, I had to leave the country, and the main reason for now was the medical checkup. Right. Because you know, in Eswatini, the health system has collapsed, and it's risky to attend a doctor in Eswatini because most of the institutions are controlled by the state. So to consult the doctor is not safe.
Do you think that you can go back to Eswatini?
Hey, it's not safe, Peter.
Because this is the second time this has happened to you.
Yeah, it's the second time. It's not safe, Peter. I have to at least investigate the seriousness of this act by the police to see if it's safe for me to go back.
The articles relate to the king directly. Do you think that the king has a hand in your arrest?
Definitely, Peter. You remember last time I told you that I received some death threats from the prince, from the king's daughter, Princess Kanyiso. She warned me against writing articles about herself and the entire royal family. And most of the time, my articles are exposing the highest authorities, and I was told that the king also complained about these articles. And even the police mentioned that when I write these articles, the king will ask them, what are they doing?
All right, Zweli, we're going to have to leave it there, but thanks so much indeed for joining us, and these articles that you're writing at great risk to yourself. Thank you so much indeed for sharing them with us. All right, so that was a conversation that I had with Zweli. Martin Dlamini. He was in studio last week, and yeah, he had to leave the country, and this is the second time that he's had to do that. I then spoke to the Eswatini police spokesperson, Pindile Velakati, and she told me that the police went to search his place and seized some items. They took him for an interview and then released him on the same day. She says that he wasn't arrested. She added that the matter is still under investigation and cannot divulge all the content pending finalization. When I asked her about the torture claims, she said that we are not aware of such, but if he claims that it really happened, he has a right to report it. If he fears going to the police station, he can come to police headquarters, complaints and discipline department. He has a right to report. So that's the official response from the Eswatini police. We'll have more for you as we start looking at local papers after this. Stay with us. Welcome back. We're starting to wrap things up, and as always, we're going to race through all of the stories in the newspapers. But let's start with you, Kate. What grabbed your attention?
So, I mean, obviously all the coronavirus stories, but the one that I looked at was this Gordon's latest questionable appointment. And why I found that interesting was that there was a response from the Independent, because what had happened, obviously, is that they had asked questions, and then the ministry had been quite unhappy and had put out a statement saying, we're very worried about these questions. And they themselves had then again responded. And the questions are all around the Independent's membership of the Press Council. And I do think it's an important issue. We want as many publications as possible to be part of the Press Council. It's great to have your own internal ombud, but we as SANEF have always said it's really important that you have an industry body. And I think it's important for the public, because the public needs to know, if I'm unhappy with the story, I can go somewhere. And I do think it's unfortunate that the Independent is not part of the Press Council.
All right, this is interesting, and we're going to explore that whole thing about the Independent, because there's a story a little bit later on about this, but we'll get to that.
Yes.
Paula?
So for me, really, the big stories of the day would be the coronavirus. I think it's the most important, but also important because the media really has an important role to play in terms of giving people the kind of information that they can make informed choices, but also not panic. I think one of the big issues is that there's a potential here for people to panic unnecessarily if we don't do the story properly. And what I really liked about the City Press story actually is that apart from the front page story, that if you open up the newspaper, there's quite a lot of information inside about what you need to know about the virus, but also how people are actually coping with it in countries where the virus is obviously taken a root in a much bigger way.
I am worried though that because I've tried to get some hand sanitizers at a shop recently, all sold out. There's no masks for love nor money out there, so it seems as if the panic has set in, but actually the risk is quite low still in South Africa, isn't it?
And in fact, I mean, so some really good journalism being done by Becky Cisa, which is it focuses on health issues, particularly telling people about, you know, who needs the mask. It's the nurse who's dealing with very sick patients that needs the mask. We should not be going out and panic buying. There are many ways to actually deal with it without necessarily even having to have hand sanitizer.
All right, well, this leads me to this Mail and Guardian story where they wrote about we won't go. The army saying that they're struggling to get this rescue mission off the ground. And there's been all these denials that this has happened. It struck me as odd, to be honest, because I've never heard of a soldier saying, I'm not going to follow orders. What was your take on this bizarre story?
Well, it was interesting because it was picked up by a lot of news stations post the story going out. I mean, it is strange because, I mean, the army, you've got to go. I mean, there's no question. So yeah, I mean, I think what we don't want is a situation where, you know, people feel that, you know, even the army is panicking and don't want to go. So I think that's one of the things that we should sort of try and avoid.
Paula, would you have run the story?
I would have run the story, but I would not have run the headline. Because, I mean, if I read the story, I found it really difficult to see how strong the headline was based on what was in the story.
But also just quickly to say, but there was something very interesting about the Mail and Guardian this week, because they were putting a number of good news stories. And I know that's sometimes counter-journalism, but I thought that was quite a clever strategy. And I must say, I liked a lot of those stories. I found them, I really felt heartened, because they were well argued, evidence-based, good stories, and I thought that was interesting.
All right, okay, because time is not on our side. I know that SANEF went to meet with the president in Cape Town, and this is something that hasn't happened all that often in the past, and I wonder what did this represent and what did you talk about?
Yeah, so it was great. I mean, the last time we had a full kind of industry SANEF meeting was in 2018, and so there have definitely been problems, you know, in terms of us meeting with the president on a regular basis. And it's very important for the country's journalists to be able to have that access. And so what was positive about this meeting was a commitment from the presidency that we will meet quarterly, have quarterly briefings, and we will actually have a big lekgotla where we can kind of thrash out a whole lot of big stories and big issues. And so I think that the meeting was very positive from the media side. And also we had a great turnout. We had like editors from across the board, and that was, I think, very positive.
Right. Do you think the relationship between government and the media has improved?
I think, I mean,
What's your gut feeling?
I do.
Yes.
I think it's important to have a good working relationship with the presidency, but I don't think that we need to have a sweetheart relationship with the presidency.
I think that's incredibly important. So what I'm wanting to say is that those channels of communication need to be open, and it's not to say that journalists didn't ask some very tough questions. I mean, I actually think the president looked quite tired at the end of that briefing. So it's precisely what Paul is saying. It's channels of communications open, everybody giving access, as much access as possible, but not easy questions, sweetheart, we let you off the hook. That would be absolutely
a problem. And he's quite happy to engage on that
level.
He
does. And I think that was what was quite positive, was that, and I think that under Zuma we didn't have that, and now there's a shift. And so I would say that the relations have improved in a good way for democracy.
Okay, so then there's another curious case. A young journalist wrote about the Daily Maverick, and he says that he stopped writing for them because he felt that he was being told to write negative articles, and it struck me as quite odd. Daily Maverick says that they're going to sue him and the Independent online for writing this story. And a few things came up for me, but I just want to get your sense. Let's start with you, Paula. When this story played out, what did anything concern you? What came to mind?
So when I first saw the story on social media, I mean, my immediate reaction is to kind of look at what the evidence is. And so I read the story, and there wasn't sufficient evidence in my mind. Just because somebody said something doesn't mean that we need to publish it. We need to actually verify that it is in fact true. And we need to verify it with other sources, and we need to verify the actual information that is in the story. And so I had some concerns about the content of the story and the information that was being peddled as fact. I have a bigger concern, though, about how hoaxes or how issues on social media without any evidence can be picked up with legacy media with minimal questioning or verification. Because what happens is that something then that should not really be treated seriously comes into legacy media and then gets taken seriously and gets given a semblance of credibility. I think it's really important for journalists to make sure that they're doing basic journalism with verification. Even if they're just reporting something that's been on social media, they should not be reporting it until they've done their own checks.
Is this a conversation that editors are having? Because the backdrop for me of this, I get a sense, and I'm not surprised by some of the headlines we're seeing in this paper, the Independent, that it could be, I don't know, newspapers are fighting each other now, and they're using their papers for these personal battles, and the poor readers get caught up in the middle of all of this.
I mean, I think that is a huge problem, and I do think that what happens is the entire industry's credibility then gets eroded, because people don't really pick up, it was this particular paper, or it was that particular paper, or that media house. There's just an overall sense, they don't even trust each other. They're fighting each other, and I think that is very, very damaging for our industry. And so we at SANEF are very worried about that. All
right. Okay. So the one last thing that I wanted to inquire about, one of the papers said new cases of coronavirus detected, and they left it at that. And so the second person in South Africa was found to be positive, but it created the impression that there were many more cases in South Africa. But when you start reading the story, you find out actually the other cases are in South Korea. And I wonder, is that naughty journalism? What's your take when you see a headline that I think misleads a little bit?
So, it kind of also picks up what we've just been talking about, right? Because trust is our currency as the media. So when our readers and our viewers and our listeners begin to lose trust in us, it really kind of undermines not only the media house itself, but the institution of journalism. And I think, for me, I start off on the thing that journalism is integral to a democracy. It's really vital to our democracy. And so my concern is bigger than simply whether we think that the Daily Maverick or the Star or the Citizen or whatever isn't performing its job. It's whether we undermine the institution of journalism and the media as a whole.
Yeah. And particularly in a crisis situation like the coronavirus, I mean, the role of the media is even more important during those kind of crises. And so what you're wanting is that kind of balanced, fair, fact-checked, evidence-backed. That's what we're needing.
All right, ladies, we've run out of time, and these things go by so quickly. But thank you so much indeed for your thoughts, your contributions, and insights. Always powerful. And happy International Women's Day once again. To you at home, thanks very much indeed for watching Media Monitor, and hope that you'll join us again next week at the same time for more of the same. Have a great International Women's Day to all of our ladies, women, and girl children around the world. And stand by, because the agenda is coming up with Blame.